Right. If I could ask everyone just to take a seat and so that we can start with this important session. It's my pleasure this afternoon to welcome you on behalf of the African Development Bank to this session that we organized jointly with our partners, notably HIVOS, on inclusive policies and finance for sustainable energy access. And we're very pleased to have such a distinguished panel with the Honorable Minister of the Netherlands, directors from the World Bank, from UNIDO, from representatives from Germany, Kenya, as well as from Sustainable Energy for All. I think sometimes we sound a bit like a broken record because most of our speeches seem to begin with the statement that Africa is at a turning point and that access to sustainable energy services is a critical development enabler. Yet, at the same time, I think it is a message that cannot be overemphasized. As the SDG 7 tracking reports that were released earlier this year clearly demonstrated, I think for the first time, the absolute number of people without access to electricity in sub-Saharan Africa has begun to fall, thanks to an electrification rate that has begun to outpace population growth, mainly driven by strong performance in East Africa. For example, electricity access in Kenya has been growing steadily over the last few years, from 32% in 2013 to 56% in 2016, including through projects such as the Last Mile Energy Access projects that we finance from the African Development Bank side, alongside the World Bank and others, as well as, of course, the growth of the decentralized energy solutions led by companies such as Copper and others. While this progress clearly is remarkable, sub-Saharan Africa remains the most exposed region in terms of energy deficit, amount for 16 out of the top 20 access deficit countries, and 79% of the global access deficit in terms of population. Furthermore, the urban-rural chasm in electricity access remains wide, with almost 9 out of 10 Africans without electricity living in rural areas. The urgency to remedy this situation and move the continent forward is precisely why the African Development Bank has placed energy at the very top of its agenda for Africa. This commitment is enshrined in the strategy for the New Deal on Energy for Africa, whose overarching objective is to assure universal energy access in the continent by 2025, which is even 5 years ahead of SDG 7, yet at the same time fully consistent with the SDGs, given that we need to have access to energy well before 2030 if we are to achieve most of the other SDGs. Ladies and gentlemen, achieving this great ambition for the continent requires significant investments on the scale that means that we cannot achieve this in isolation. We must pool together everyone. We must leverage our scarce public resources in the best possible way to crowd in more private sector investments in order to be able to move from billions to trillions. However, to successfully do this, we first must address the challenges that stand in the way of effective collaboration and resource mobilization. These include weak enabling environments in many countries, political and foreign exchange risks, and policy and regulatory bottlenecks. To this end, the African Development Bank established earlier this year the Africa Energy Marketplace, a tripartite platform whose goal it is to remove barriers for private sector investments in the energy sector. We are already seeing the results of this critical platform with traction on financing and policy reforms for projects in the first round of countries from Cote d'Ivoire to Ethiopia, Nigeria, Zambia, South Africa, and Tanzania. And we indeed invite all partners to join us on this effort. Ladies and gentlemen, the African Development Bank fully recognizes that universal energy access in Africa is only achievable if we also significantly scale up the deployment of decentralized energy solutions. This is why we launched the Off-Grid Revolution by mobilizing funding, pushing for the right regulations, achieving economies of scale, addressing currency risk, and convening governments to provide incentives for off-grid solutions. We approved a first off-grid project with an innovative local currency receivables-backed financing structure earlier this year, and we intend to replicate this in other countries. We launched a facility for energy inclusion to catalyze growth in last-mile energy access solutions, and we are working on innovative structures to scale up the deployment of mini-grids in countries such as Nigeria, where we work closely with the World Bank, Burkina Faso and DRC, including with the support of financing from the Green Climate Fund. Ladies and gentlemen, I would be remiss if I didn't share with you our focus on inclusivity and the emphasis we place on women and girls throughout the energy value chain. All our lofty energy access ambitions would fall tragically short of transformational impact if they didn't truly appreciate and embed gender considerations in energy access, affordability, reliability, and sustainability. As we all know, in many regions, women and girls bear some of the worst burdens of the energy access deficit. And time again, research has demonstrated the transformational impact of energy access on the socioeconomic empowerment of women, education for girls, and the quality of life of our communities. Women play a key role as consumers, but more importantly also as energy producers and suppliers. And for that same reason, they often have significant knowledge about local conditions and resources. For the African Development Bank, representation of women in energy policy and decision-making is not merely altruistic. It is smart and it is strategic to have those who hold the key to some of the most transformational solutions at the table. It is smart to have their insight informing decentralized energy solutions innovations, design, and implementation. To honor these convictions, we're equipping women in entrepreneurial and industrial energy sectors with the requisite technical and financial resources to enhance their contribution to energy solutions, including the adoption of innovative and cleaner energy solutions. As a result of a feasibility study on business opportunities for women in a changing energy value chain in West Africa, which we worked on in partnership with our friends of the ECOWAS Center for Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency, ECRI, as well as the NEPAD Infrastructure Project Preparation Facility, we are better able to provide partners with nuanced perspectives on mainstreaming gender in the energy value chain and better understanding the operational and financial profile of women-owned businesses. Further, through our involvement in a new work stream on gender and energy of the Global Network of Sustainable Energy Centers and our own inclusive infrastructure initiative, we continue to ensure that women and girls are not left behind in the quest for energy transformation, but rather are at the center of it. As you can see, ladies and gentlemen, the task ahead is arduous. It is why partnerships are so critically important and why we are so pleased that we could co-organize this important event with some of our key partners here today. So, as I conclude, let me reiterate the urgency for us to join forces, to work together towards the collective goal of lighting up and powering Africa. Thank you very much for your attention. And I think most importantly, before I forget, of course, to hand over to the moderator of this session, to Carol from HEROS. Thank you.
Thank you, Danielle, and thank you also for really kickstarting this session. I really liked your off-grid revolution, and I think it's really nice also to hear from you how the African Development Bank really looks at inclusion and specifically women and girls. Just to remind you all, today is Gender Day. So I think in this discussion today on inclusive policies and finance, we should be talking about gender as well. So thank you for starting that off. I'm Carol Gribnall. I'm Program Director Green Society at HEVOS. For those who are not familiar with HEVOS, just a very short introduction. We're an international NGO with a global office based in the Netherlands, but with regional offices across the different continents. And our main role is really connecting local projects and partners with a global change agenda, including in the energy field. I'm very happy with this session of today on inclusive finance and policies, a very important topic to reach the SDGs and the Paris Agenda. We all know that access to energy is an enabler for reaching most of the SDGs, and that also a transformation to sustainable forms of energy is critical from the perspective of climate change. We also know that still 3 billion people are without access to electricity, 1 billion, sorry, and 3 billion without access to clean cooking. And data is also telling us that financing is not reaching those that need it most, especially low-income countries, rural communities, but also women and girls. We have a very large panel today reflecting different perspectives from a wide range of global leading institutions. So I will briefly introduce the panel. So there's Riccardo Pulitti. He is Senior Director for Energy and Extractives of the World Bank. We have Honorable Minister Sigrid Kaag from the Netherlands, Minister for Foreign Trade and Development Cooperation. We have Tarek Mtairai, sorry, I may mispronounce, Director of the Energy Department of UNIDO. There's Esther Wangombe. She's Deputy Director Renewable Energy of the Ministry of Energy of the Federal Republic of Kenya. Then there is Frank Fass-Metz, Commissioner for Climate Policy and Climate Finance and Deputy Director General at BMZ. And Mr. Glenn Pierce-Oros, Director of Policy and Programs at SE4All. So very warm welcome to all of you, and of course also very warm welcome to all of you participants. So we're going to listen to the different speakers on your ideas on inclusive policies and finance, and really looking at how can we enable access to energy for those countries, communities, and people that need it most. And in doing so, there is a slide, I think, which is meant as a source of inspiration because, I mean, in these debates, we easily forget the real people of whom we're talking. So this is Niru Shrestha of Nepal, who got a loan from a local finance institute, but the amount is too little for upfront investments for stocking her commercial, her business on sustainable energy technologies. And also loans from commercial banks are too expensive or not accessible to her. And she's a clear example of the kind of entrepreneurs we often talk about in these kind of discussions. So let's keep her in mind in whatever we discuss today. So now I'm going to hand over to the first speaker, who will set, well, building on what Daniel already mentioned, who will further set the scene. So Riccardo Pulitti. And you will present the importance of sound policy and regulatory frameworks for improving energy access and increasing renewable energy, drawing on the key findings of the Regulatory Indicators for Sustainable Energy, the RISE 2018 report. Here you go.
Thank you, Carol. Carol, thank you very much indeed, and good afternoon to everybody, Excellency, colleagues, friends. A big thank you to the African Development Bank, to Daniel. Thank you very much for this welcome. So I'm going to talk about policy and finance for renewable energy and energy access. I'm happy to discuss all these policy matters in this forum because my team and I have been discussing the importance of our policy and regulatory support to clients since I joined the World Bank 2 years ago. I'm pleased that we are joined today by several of our donor partners in the Energy Sector Management Assistance Program, which is a partnership between the World Bank and 18 development partners. Without ESMAP, we would not be able to provide the policy and technical assistance support that our clients need. I believe strongly, and the evidence shows, that policies and regulations are critical when countries are seeking to attract new investment and make progress towards the Sustainable Development Goals. At the World Bank, we have a long track record of supporting the expansion of energy access, both on-grid and off-grid, and rural and urban electrification. In fact, between the years 2014 and 2017, we committed $3.6 billion of energy access programs. And just last year alone, we committed 1.4 billion only on access. We should be happy about that, but we are not, because we are not achieving what we would like to do. That doesn't mean that we're not to make more efforts. The progress is tangible. Sub-Saharan Africa's electricity deficit has started to close for the first time. Countries like Cambodia, Bangladesh, Ethiopia, Kenya, Nepal, Rwanda, and Tanzania have become leaders in bringing electricity service to their population. And India is providing new connections to 30 million people annually, more than any other country. But as we look to build on this progress and expand it further, we conducted a global stock-taking of the policies and regulations necessary to achieve Sustainable Development Goal number 7. We measured the country-level adoption of policies and regulation for electricity access, clean cooking, energy efficiency, and renewable energy across 133 developed and developing economies, from Afghanistan to Zimbabwe. We conduct this research to help national policymakers to benchmark their energy sector policy and regulatory framework against regional and global peers. We learned that the countries with the lowest electrification rates in the world, along with fragile and conflict states, are the countries that require the largest improvements in their policy and regulatory environments. This is not surprising, but shows where we need to be offering support and sharing good practices. Also, unsurprisingly, the countries that have increased their electricity access rates the most since 2010 have also shown a concurrent improvement in electricity access policies. So success in access goes together with success in implementing access policies. The 5 countries that saw the highest increase in their access rates since 2010 are Burkina Faso, Democratic Republic of Congo, Ethiopia, Kenya, and Tanzania. All of them have made progress on their regulatory frameworks for electricity access. Kenya, in particular, stands out for its accelerated progress on energy access, underpinned by the rapid adoption of supporting policy measures. Kenya is a country where we work very much hand-to-hand, hand-in-hand with the African Development Bank. I also want to highlight the importance of long-term national electrification and policy planning. As we have seen in Rwanda, in 2019, Rwanda launched its nationwide electricity access rollout program, which aligned electrification efforts and international support around national policies and priorities. The result has been a tripling of the share of people connected to the grid, from 10% to 29% in 7 years, and extension of electricity to the vast majority of schools, health centers, and administrative centers in the country. So policies, planning, that's really what we found is important. It is clear that there is a virtuous link between smart, well-enforced policies and progress towards improving access rate. It is equally clear that the historically poor creditworthiness of utilities is undermining investment in sustainable energy. As of 2016, roughly half of the power utilities met several basic creditworthiness thresholds, but the situation is quite difficult in countries with low access to electricity. So it's regulation, it's planning, it's creditworthiness of utilities. The link between smart policies, utilities creditworthiness, and long-term investment is very much clear to us. We have seen that work at the policy and technical assistance level can contribute to scale up private sector interest. Certainly, we can make all the effort possible, but without attracting and retaining the private sector, it will be very, very difficult. In addition, or finally, it's important to put in place the incentives risk mitigation mechanisms, and innovative financial structure that can provide a real boost for private sector investment. A country's continued commitment to energy sector reforms can, over the long term, reduce the risk and provide a suitable environment needed for sustained investment. What do we want to mean? Guarantees, de-risking instruments are great in a contingent situation, but the real long-term goals are achieved through reforms. Only reforms can get you to access. If we can work on these aspects with our clients and our partners, we can help accelerate improvements in access rates and the clean energy transition by attracting and, more importantly, retaining private sector investment. At the World Bank, we remain more committed than ever to helping countries accelerate the energy transition to deliver sustainable, reliable, and affordable energy for all. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for highlighting the critical importance of policies for enabling access to energy and also for bringing in private sector engagement. So I would like to hand over now the floor to Honorable Minister Kaag. We know the Netherlands is working hard to accelerate the energy transition. We're moving away from gas, for instance. But you also just launched the Dutch Fund for Climate and Development with a very strong focus on least developed countries and including a very strong focus on access to renewable energy. So very curious to hear your views on inclusive policies and finance.
Is it on? Yeah. Well, actually, I think it's not necessarily rocket science, to be totally honest. I have to take the science out of it. I think what we're doing makes plain common sense, and in a way it is a delayed action to necessary steps that need to be taken. I think the first two speakers have spoken to it, but the energy field in that sense is not actually necessarily unique to many other fields of development where you look at rights, access, what is required. What we're looking at through the fund, but the fund is just one channel, is we know we are serious about reaching the Paris goals, the Paris Agreement. We know without climate adaptation mitigation, we will not really achieve the Agenda 2030. So it's a parallel and a convergent track. That is the starting point. The second one is that of course we want to lift and help those most vulnerable on the one hand, and lift the sort of go for the bottom billion, so to speak, lift them out of poverty. And access to energy, renewable energy, is not only the right thing to do, it is a necessity. If we want to really anticipate and prevent future climate-inspired sort of disasters, so to speak, inspired is the wrong word, climate-triggered disasters, people on the move, etc. So it's a prevention agenda as much as a protection agenda. With that, technology plays a key role, we've heard it. The policy environment, national planning, ownership by governments and participation of all partners, not just NGO partners, very critical to have access to the most vulnerable and speak with them, enable them to express voice, but also the private sector. So the fund is a trigger. The fund is an invitation to provide proof of concept of how we can work. 65% of the funding will be dedicated to adaptation and 35% is for mitigation. These are country-led examples. The second part is if we look at gender, 50% of the world's population, also systematically amongst the most marginalized, we will give priority to anything that renders access in an inclusive way to women when it comes to access to the grid, alternative energy solutions, and of course we're looking at decentralized solutions. But that again to me is the 101 of development. A lot of the solutions are decentralized and they are bottom up. So I would say in a nutshell, that is our approach. I don't think I need to convince anyone in this room. The question is how we can accelerate and how we can reach scale. That to me is the critical question. It's an alliance, it's a partnership, but we really need to get up to speed with this, which of course why this conference is so important and why we are delighted to be co-chairing together with Costa Rica the NDCP, because it's all about action on the ground. As donor countries, we have the duty of care to invest And as a country that is number 2 on the Global Index of Innovation, we have the capacity to give access to technology that can just make or break. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and very interesting to hear how you relate to people, vulnerable people, and how access to energy can really lift them out of poverty. I mean, Tarek and Tarai, you're the next speaker. UNIDO is supporting the establishment of regional sustainable energy centers. Also, UNIDO is increasingly working on the interlinkage between gender and energy. So we're having high expectations on your topic of inclusion and of policy in and finance.
Thank you, Carol, and Honorable Minister and distinguished participant. And it's, first of all, I have to thank the Africa Development Bank for hosting this and for bringing this important topic. Allow me to step back and say that the perspective I come to this discussion is from the mandate of UNIDO, because we are our mandate is to work with our member states on the industrial development agenda and job creation through manufacturing. And the energy access is intimately linked to this formula in two essential ways. The first is that actually you cannot create development and manufacturing without energy, but also the clean energy agenda itself is a source and an inspiration for creating entrepreneurship, and particularly women-led entrepreneurship in Africa, and this is the experience we have been able to demonstrate through our intervention and technical assistance. So our technical assistance programs in Africa particularly tend to have a number of dimensions. One of them, of course, to look at the enabling environment that Ricardo and Daniel mentioned, the policy side and the general administrative side. But then there is another dimension of the enabling ecosystem, which is the availability of entrepreneurs, value chain and supply chain to get the access solutions delivered on the ground. And this is where we feel not enough attention being paid, and that's where we think there's a lot of work can be done there by empowering men and women and young entrepreneurs to enterprise around energy solutions, either in the clean cooking fuels, and the clean cooking value chain, in the distributed energy solutions. We see tremendous opportunities there, but they need, of course, also a lot of capacity building. Part of our intervention is to handhold some of these entrepreneurs' needs, also what I call facilitations, mentoring. The transaction costs tend to be high in this kind of services, but it's essentially needed because the payback can be shown to actually very quickly to deliver on the ground. So this is where I see the linkages and the attention that could be paid more to this area.
Thank you. And knowing UNIDO, it's clear you were going to highlight the role of entrepreneurs in this accelerating access to energy agenda. So thank you for highlighting that. Then we're going to move to Esther Wangombe. Already Ricardo Puliti mentioned Kenya a couple of times in his introduction as one of the countries that is really setting the example in accelerating access to energy. So we hope to hear more from you on how Kenya is managing to do so.
Okay. Thank you. Kenya has roughly a population of 48 million. Those are very many people. And the population is scattered in 47 counties. So we are not in settlements where electricity can be supplied that fast. So the economy of our country is in transition and has been promoting low carbon, diverse energy mix. The government has, over the last few years, embarked on a journey to provide access to reliable, safe, and sustainable energy. The access rate has been on the rise. In 2014, the access rate in the country was 32%. By June 2018, it stood at 75%. So the access rate has been on the rise. How has we achieved this? We have done it through interventions by the government and collaboration with the development partners. And of course, the government has an enabling policy through the Constitution of Kenya, the Constitution of 2010. We have the Energy Policy of 2004. We have the Energy Act of 2006. We also have the Kenya Vision 2030. Apart from the enabling policy, we also have the renewable energy regulations, several of them. Among them, we have the improved biomass cook stove regulations. We also have the solar photovoltaic system regulations of 2012. We do have the energy management regulations of 2012. We also have the solar water heating regulations also of 2012. And I want to mention that a lot has been achieved through scaling up of off-grid options. Because I said that our country, we have 48 million people who are scattered all over the country. So the off-grid systems, including the mini-grids, including the solar home systems, including the institutional solar photovoltaic systems, they have actually assisted a lot in increasing energy access in the country. And I want to mention that World Bank has also been very key in these off-grid solutions. There is a World Bank project that is ongoing, which is covering 14 counties, which are in the remote parts of the country. So, when this project is over, we expect access rate to be much, much higher than the 75% we are talking about today. And I want to mention here that last week the government launched the Kenya National Electrification Strategy. And this strategy is meant to address broadly the necessary policy direction, investments needed, and the collaboration environment required to achieve universal access to electricity in Kenya by 2022. Of course, there are challenges we have been encountering, because despite this achievement by the government in connecting Kenyans to electricity, there are still Kenyans without access to electricity. Basically, due to the nature of settlements, you find that some people are settled in such remote areas where even the infrastructure, the road to reach them, hardly exists. Also, the costs involved. It may look like the mini-grids or the home solar systems are cheap, but some people don't even have the money they cannot afford to have those systems. I cannot conclude before mentioning clean cooking, where in rural areas and other remote parts of the country, you find that some people have access to electricity. Yes, they have the solar, the bulbs, lighting their homes, but you find that the women in those homesteads, they use firewood to cook. So as they use firewood, they smoke, which emanates from the cooking. Then the bulbs become sooty. The soot settles on the bulbs. So the lighting becomes dimmer and dimmer as time goes by. So we need to address clean cooking solutions. Of course, sustainable energy for all has been addressing that, but it has not covered the entire country. Resources are required. You find that many women, they lack access to modern sources of energy, including the cooking solutions. Much as we talk of the improved cook stoves, you find that some women cannot afford. They cannot even afford the meko. The small, we call them the meko, the small gases. The gas is packaged in 6 kgs, 3 kgs, but not all women in the remote areas or in the rural settings can afford that. So it is important that apart from the lighting solutions, these women need to be empowered through entrepreneurship activities to be able to increase their incomes and hence be able to afford clean energy cooking solutions. And we also have had projects where people assume that women need some certain types of stoves without involving them. It is important that it's important that any person wishing to do a project on on clean cooking, involve the women, discuss with them, so that you can know the advantages and disadvantages of some stoves. Because there are some stoves which, yes, they are energy efficient, but women say no, when they use them, they are not able to warm their households. So you will introduce the stove, yes, but they will keep it aside once you go. So it's important that women are involved in decision making, in making solutions to their problems, including the cooking solutions. And it's also important, as we talk of clean cooking, it is important that anybody thinking of clean cooking, issues of woodlot establishment, planting trees where these women will get the firewood to cook is also important. There's so much we can talk about in Kenya, but because of time, thank you.
Thank you, and for sharing already a bit on Kenya's leading example in terms of creating the right policies and working with partners to accelerate access to energy. And thank you also for flagging in terms of in an inclusivity agenda, we need to think beyond electricity. We need to consider also clean cooking solutions as part of the challenge ahead. So thank you. Then we're going to move further to the next speaker, Frank Fass-Metz. Germany just doubled its pledge for the Green Climate Fund, being one of the first to do so during COP24. Congratulations. Last year, Germany started also the Green People's Energy for Africa initiative, with the goal to broaden Germany's support to decentralized energy solutions in rural areas through municipalities, private investments, and local cooperatives. And well, good to hear more about your policies on inclusive finance for renewable energy.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to AFDB for inviting us to this interesting panel. Actually, I wanted to share an observation with you that within the discussion, listening to the previous speakers, I heard the reference to climate being done only by women. Minister Kak, you pointed out that we cannot think about access to energy, about development, without thinking about how are we going to do the transformation to implement the Paris Agreement. We heard from our moderator the reference to climate, and also from Kenya the importance to look on addressing the energy access dimension through the transformation to renewable energy and low carbon development. And I felt this was really interesting that the man on the podium did not make this reference here. So from our perspective, and that's key element of what is our strategy, that we need to bring development and climate together. And only through this we will achieve the SDGs, we will achieve SDG 7, and we will also achieve the implementation of the Paris Agreement. Germany is very much engaged in advancing access to energy. Our investments 2017 in the energy sector amounted to 2.7 billion totally. So this is a huge dimension of our approach, and all is focused on renewable energy. We are working through bilateral mechanisms, our bilateral program, but of course also through multilateral mechanisms. You made reference to our announcement to contribute to the replenishment of the Green Climate Fund. And this is part of our engagement of bringing climate dimensions and energy dimensions together. Through the Green Climate Fund, I think we have seen several funding proposals coming forward, focusing specifically on generating energy access, presented by African Development Bank and others. So this is an important dimension we feel we should support, and I hope many others will support also through the replenishment process of the GCF. Last year, Germany launched the so-called Green People's Energy Initiative for Africa, where our ministry intends to focus specifically on enhancing access in decentralized areas through establishing conducive political administrative framework conditions for local energy cooperatives and on-site productive use of energy. Because we know if we don't bring reliable energy to rural areas in a carbon-friendly way, we will not achieve development, and we will not achieve neither the Paris objectives. This, of course, implies capacity building, support to the local and community level on implementing energy progress, the development of energy systems from the bottom up, and also building up local capacity to make a business case out of the investment in renewable energy, to generate income at the local level. So this is a key focus of our development program, and we hope through this helping in generating more access, but it's not all what we're doing. We are also supporting Africa at large to advance renewable energies in line with the objectives of the Africa Renewable Energy Initiative launched by Africa at COP24, where Africa intends to achieve 10 gigawatts of new renewable energy generation capacity by 2015. And at COP21, the G7 plus the Netherlands pledged $10 billion to support this initiative. And I'm happy to say that Germany, of its original pledge of 3 billion euros, already is implementing 2.3 billion euros. With that said, I just want to close with agreeing to Minister Kaak on the importance of addressing the gender dimensions in energy. Without looking on the gender dimensions, we will not achieve neither empowerment of women, neither the development objectives. So it's a key dimension also in our approach. And I'm happy to see this very close approach, particularly with the Netherlands tomorrow taking up the co-chairmanship for the NEC partnership from Germany. So very close ally. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and also thank you for flagging the importance of linking the whole energy discussion to the climate change agenda, which seems an obvious one, but sometimes is also not, very high in the discussion or on the agenda. And also for flagging the importance of local level implementation, looking beyond the national level, national governments, but really sub-national local authorities. Then we're over to the last speaker, Mr. Glenn Pierce-Arros of SE4All. SE4All just launched the new Energizing Finance report, which is a good tradition of yearly reporting on financial flows for electricity and clean cooking access. And SE4All also runs the People-Centered Accelerator, which is a voluntary partnership of stakeholders interested in advancing gender equality, social inclusion, and women's empowerment in the sustainable energy sector. Well, we've already heard from quite a number of the previous speakers the importance of really taking into account women and girls, which is also high on your agenda. So over to you to hear more.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Carol. And thank you to the hosts, African Development Bank, to the organizers, and thank you to my fellow colleagues here who have, I think, really put some interesting ideas on the table. I'll do my best to summarize a bit, even though that's your job, Carol, and add a bit of our perspective from SE4All. And the way I'd like to summarize, as I've been listening to the different speakers, is on three concepts. The first one, focus. The second one, reform. And the third one, invest. And by focus, I'd like to touch on the report that Carol mentioned, which was Energizing Finance. Energizing Finance, we track financial flows in the 20 countries that represent 80% of the access deficit. 16 of those countries are in sub-Saharan Africa. And what's important with that tracking of the financial flows is that even though we were able to identify $39 billion between public, private, international, domestic, the large portion of those $39 billion were not in Africa. In fact, less than $2 billion, if you take Kenya out of the equation, because Kenya has done quite well. If you take Kenya out of it, less than $2 billion going to those 16 countries in sub-Saharan Africa. So focus, the idea, where do we focus our energies? Let's focus on those countries that are not receiving the financial flows necessary. Second, very important number, 30 million with an M, $30 million were able to be tracked in terms of investment to clean cooking. And I'm glad everyone is sitting down because the estimated need for clean cooking is $4.4 billion a year, and that's with a B, and we were only able to track $30 million. So big, big effort, challenge for all of us in terms of clean cooking. So focus on those 20 countries, focus on the 16 in particular in sub-Saharan Africa that are not receiving the financing necessary. Second big idea is reform. And here I'd like to pick up on what Ricardo was saying. An incredibly important database of indicators was released just a couple of days ago. RISE report, 2018. Regulatory indicators for sustainable energy. For those of you who have your phones out, you know who you are, or your laptops out. You have my permission to Google rise.smap.org. If you go to rise.smap.org, I guarantee you will find more data on 133 countries that than you thought could be compiled in one site. And so please make use of this. This is a global public good. And I think Ricardo would, and the rest of us would join me in encouraging you to look at that website, look at the data, and do the analyses that you see fit. We will be working on a gender lens, in staying with the theme of the sub-theme of the day, a gender lens of the RISE data in the countries where we're trying to focus on. But reform doesn't come easy. Our Deputy Director, Esther, from Kenya, mentioned very quickly, but very important, 2004 a reform, an important reform, 2006. Well, that was already 14 years ago. And so to get things moving, we desperately need these reforms to take place in these countries if the financing will follow. Third important idea, and with this I'll come to a close, is investment. And what do we need in terms of generating the investment in these different countries? We don't need the financing from the big boys only. Yes, World Bank, yes, African Development Bank, yes, other MDBs, please continue. But we need to start focusing on the meso and the micro levels. What are the necessary financial models to be able to reach out to decentralized solutions, to be able to invest in off-grid solutions? They're not there yet. I guarantee they're not there yet in most of the countries. What are the financial models for consumers that will be needed? And what are the business models? All of this we can, I think, easily grasp in terms of access to electricity. Multiply that by 1,000 for clean cooking. We have no idea yet. And so we really need to think differently in terms of big markets for clean fuels in terms of clean cooking if we're going to make a dent into the SDGs and certainly SDG 7. So I'll leave it with that, and I'll channel Rachel Kite with this last idea, which is we not only need to lean in, we need to lean in until we fall down, trying to get this to work, and get this to work extremely quickly because time is running out. Thanks very much, Carol.
Thank you, and thank you also for summarizing the discussion, but also making it sharper in terms of what is it that we're talking about when we talk about inclusion, and really focusing on those that need it most in terms of countries, especially Sub-Saharan Africa, as you mentioned, but also let's not again forget about clean cooking as well. Reforms definitely necessary, and investments at meso and micro level. I'm very happy to introduce to you a number of discussants we've invited, and I'm sure that they're going to raise some interesting questions also to the panel based on what we've just heard. So happy to introduce, first of all, David Lecoq. He's Head Policy and Business Development of the Alliance for Rural Electrification. Okay, sorry. Yeah, I forgot to excuse the minister because I understood that you have to leave. Yes, exactly. So I think this is a good moment before we start the discussion.
Ik was just warning her. Ja, dankjewel, sorry. We moeten even met Wiebes op Facebook. Dankjewel.
Yes. Okay. So, sorry for that. So again, David Lecoq, Head Policy and Business Development of the Alliance for Rural Electrification. We have Ana Rojas, Gender, Energy and Sustainable Development Specialist at the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, and Ben Garside, Principal Researcher and Energy Lead at the International Institute for Environment and Development. Very warm welcome to all three of you. And let me start with you, Ben. You've just been doing lots of research on finance aggregators as a way to enhance energy access. Can you share some of the findings of your report and also indicate to what extent it's resonating with what you've been hearing from the panel? And if there are any questions you would like to ask to the panel, feel free to do so. Mike.
Thank you. So IIED has been looking at a number of different types of finance aggregators, talking to the aggregators themselves, but also talking to the companies that they're investing in, and really trying to understand from those companies who they're impacting, who's being reached, who their customers are. And we looked at 3 different aggregators. So a private sector example, Sunfunder, mainly funding East Africa and a little bit in India. IDCOL in Bangladesh, which is a very famous example of a publicly backed aggregator, but it's also a public-private partnership. And the Alternative Energy Promotion Center, AEPC, in Nepal. And so these aggregators, of course, theoretically, they pool finance into a portfolio, reducing costs and risks. But the range of aggregators that you see out there, they vary quite a lot. Some of these aggregators are just doing that finance aggregation. I say just, but that's obviously a very valuable thing to be doing. Some of them are aggregating demand, so aggregating groups of customers, aggregating different types of technologies and business models, and then aggregating functions like capacity building, product standards, etc. So what we've been finding by talking to these is that, first of all, that a couple of examples on the capacity building side. Sunfunder has been aggregating this finance capacity building, so providing training and guidelines for its supported businesses, and particularly the smaller scale ones. This has been extremely valuable in getting them running, getting them up to speed, enabling them to report effectively. IDCOL has been doing technical capacity building and been requiring this. So this has actually enabled the companies who are then operating in very remote areas to be having the capacity to be doing the installations. So you see, and this has been measured, that the capacity in very remote areas has improved. The quality of installations and product support has improved as a result of what the aggregator has been doing. Standards and quality assurance. IDCOL actually runs an internal regulation and quality standards process. APC has a national standards testing center. These have again helped improve the way the service has been delivered. But I think the crucial difference between the sort of South Asian examples and the East Africa ones is that that mixture of policy support with the finance that's happened much more in Nepal and in Bangladesh. That stems from the way that the finance is blended. So in Bangladesh, IDCOL actually mandates a mixture of equity, concessional loans, and grant or subsidy blend into the enterprises that it supports, and it's transitioned this over time. So if you look at solar home system markets, the subsidies have been there. They've been very useful and very important in getting the market going. They've been transitioned out with a sort of softening of concessional loans as that's happened. Now that kind of doing that at that kind of scale hasn't really happened so much with the other Sunfunder example. And with those subsidies, so that's sort of the role of public finance, because we're talking about investment, but public investment and public finance is also important. One thing that we've seen is that target setting, and I think this was mentioned, target setting, very important, but target setting that's realistic. So we've seen examples with IDCOL where they've set targets of 6 million systems and got to 4 million. And this has provided a lot of confidence in the market, really kept the market going. Targets that have been set by APC, they've actually targeted women, given an incremental subsidy to systems that have been bought by women. And this has had some interesting outcomes. They've suddenly found that 40%, that the aim of the subsidy was actually to target female-headed households, but 40% of the subsidy actually went into this incremental support. So the question there is, are the women actually benefiting from this? Because clearly households with mixed men and women, the women are being put forward to benefit from that subsidy. So I think the point is that targets are useful. Measuring the impacts of those kind of subsidy programs and targets, really understanding who is being reached and how, and then tweaking the policy and the subsidy is important. When we look at the subsidy platforms that there have been in the East African context, results-based finance has been one important instrument. I'm running out of time.
Yes.
But one of the things about RBF, and this is maybe something that can come out from the program that Daniel introduced, RBF so far has been quite piecemeal. So one of the things that the companies are telling us is that it's market distorting because it's short term. We're only going to the low-hanging fruit customers. We go to a new area, but the subsidies are there, then they finish. It doesn't really have a trickle-down effect. So how can we look at longer-term public finance is one question. How can we improve? One of our lessons is that coordination is required. So this speaks to the RISE work and the platform. How can we improve that coordination between public-private, third sector, but also between on and off-grid, where you have grid expansion going on, not necessarily talking to the off-grid, and there being conflicts there. So that's also a question. And the final point is that we see that some of these things, and some of the IDCOL and APC, there are not very good things that have happened in those examples as well. So the question is, how do we learn rapidly and tweak? Is there a space for experimentation platforms, this is just an example, at national level, that bring together rapid policy tweaking finance instruments and capacity building to really learn what works and get it to scale? Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ben, for sharing the experiences with the aggregator research and as a way to bridge, let's say, type and skill of financing on the one hand with the needs of local entrepreneurs. And thank you for the 3 questions. I hope that the panel has noted them down and will come back to you after we've heard also the other 2 discussants. So over to you, Anna. You're working on gender, energy, sustainable development. We've been hearing already a lot about women, girls, inclusion. Can you share your insights in terms of how to make sure finance indeed reaches women, both as entrepreneurs in the value chain, but also as active citizens?
Thank you, Carol, and I will try my best to be conscious of the time because it's a huge question. And let me start by saying that at the Global Gender Office at AUCN, we are absolutely not implementers, but what we do is that we are more researchers and we try to fill in information gaps. So one of the tools that we've used is what at the Global Gender Office we call the EGI, the Environment and Gender Index. And one of the reports we've had out on the energy sector is from last year. We assessed, and apologies, it's tiredness, I'm not being as eloquent as I wanted. We assessed 192 energy frameworks worldwide, and we realized that 32% of them address gender or women in one way or the other. I'll invite you to look at the report for all the details on how. But most recently, this year, we did a sub-assessment for Sub-Saharan Africa. And we found, because Sub-Saharan Africa keeps on coming in every single policy assessment we've done through the EGI, regionally top of the class. And that is also in the energy sector. From the 45 energy frameworks we looked at, 32 address women or gender. So we do see that there is a mandate. There are very different ways in which this mandate is put into place. And if you allow me to briefly go through some numbers, if this telephone works, or maybe I just don't do that, but about 23% of the frameworks alone are looking into either energy poverty or the health impacts of cooking with biomass. And to me, this is very interesting because what we've been hearing from the table is, of course, that we are not investing as much as we need to in biomass. From the 25 countries that where the population relies on biomass, 90% of the population relies on biomass, 20 are in Sub-Saharan Africa. So there is something that is the missing link between the policies, the desire, and the way implementation is going forward. So there I would just pose that question to the panel. Thinking about policy reform, how can we make those policy reform more efficient so the main policy objective actually trickles down into investments? There are very few examples that we found through this analysis in terms of creating special funds. One that comes to mind is from Rwanda and their energy framework, and this is a special fund, if I'm not mistaken, to support entrepreneurship, women's entrepreneurship. So that is one thing. The other thing when you were saying is how do we actually support that finance reaches to these women, and good examples. And the good examples are mainly coming from this aggregation that you were talking about. We have initiatives from mostly civil society organizations. Let be the Solar Sister actions in West Africa, Energia, which is an international network housed by HIVOS, which is working in Africa and also in Asia, bringing together numbers of women entrepreneurs doing training, as you were saying, which is one of the things that's necessary, but also trying to figure out what are those other elements that are of high risk to these entrepreneurs. Issues such as currency exchange. How can such an aggregator come up with a system that would allow these women entrepreneurs who do not have a lot of money for their investments to be able to say, I can cope with these changes in the currency? And I think that elements such as that, understanding better how pay-as-you-go systems could also be upscaled, would be easier, would help increase this finance. So one, policies, clear goals for coming into implementation, and two, understanding what it is that we need, that is not only bringing the money to the entrepreneurs, but definitely trying to figure out which are the risks that these entrepreneurs have to deal with so that they can have some support system until they become matured companies and they can run on their own. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. David, coming from private sector working on rural electrification, what is key to enable private sector to work in off-grid and thus increasing access to energy?
Yes, thank you for that, Carol. Well, if I may, like Mr. Mtaira said earlier, take one step back. I think the goal here that we all aspire to is to have 100% electrification, as many renewables as possible, and to do that in a least cost approach, as we discussed at the DSC for All Accelerator meeting in Dakar the other day. This is really what matters most to people. Now, the problem you see is that we still have 1 billion people without electricity, population growth outpaces energy project implementation and so on. And a big piece of that, unsurprisingly, is the access to finance discussion, which, again, out of our latest survey showcase from the sector, came out as the #1, just ahead of regulatory problems, came out the #1 problem limiting companies' ability to scale up and to replicate projects and to move from the, say, tens of projects to the thousands of projects a year that we actually would need to do. The solution for this, I don't only come with problems, I also try to come up with some solutions sometimes, is especially for those of you sitting on this distinguished panel from the public sector side, whether donors, governments, or development finance institutions, is that, well, you have both the mandate as well as the technical and the financial means, let's say, to really make a dent in this, as you are already doing to a large degree, by especially then boosting the availability of finance and the risk mitigation mechanisms to reduce these real and perceived risks in the market. So coming to my point, I think now if you see the new AFDB's facility for energy inclusion, which has an important off-grid element, you see the new EU's external investment plan, ROGEP, from the World Bank and ECRE in West Africa, you see that there are already very nicely designed mechanisms. There is also quite a bit of money, but not enough. So the question, I guess, is how can we increase the funding for these mechanisms and make sure, coming back to a point raised yesterday, that this money also arrives on the ground in the many small projects, but that together are supposed to, according to the IEA, deliver 74% of all the new connections globally achieving energy access. Perhaps an idea, an uitsmijter, as we say in Dutch, throw out, an idea could be to have a sector-wide scaling solar kind of program, but for the off-grid, right? Putting all of these different things together and really, let's say, hit the ground running much faster than what we are able to do today, even as private sector. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the questions. We have a long list. I think we can combine a few. I think, David, you were referring to de-risking and how to make sure finance reaches really those entrepreneurs that are very critical in enhancing access to renewable energy. And I think, Anna, you also talked about women entrepreneurs and the need to de-risk and to provide also capacity development support. So who of the panelists would like to talk about de-risking and reaching local entrepreneurs?
Well, de-risking is, first of all, as I said a few minutes ago, I think that the only permanent de-risking are policies, are reforms. This is the only de-risking I know. Certainly we, and the World Bank does it enormously, we offer guarantees, payment guarantees that cure, as I was saying before, the problem of the lack of creditworthiness of utilities or off-takers in general. But usually this applies to mid-size projects or large-size projects. I like the idea of pooling. You call it aggregator, but it's the same thing. I think pooling is the only way to work with small projects. I don't see any other way to do it. We usually do it through financial intermediaries because it would be too expensive if the World Bank does it. I think it is certainly a great way to get to the micro. You raised a point, sorry, about solar and small projects. I don't know whether you already heard it, but we are developing a de-risking facility for small projects together with ISA, with the International Solar Alliance. So that's maybe what you were referring to. You talked again, I'm going to you, madam, at the very last, but maybe not least, about the conflict between off-grid and on-grid. And I would add to this conflict, to the conflict generation. You cannot imagine, or maybe you know, how many African countries have more generation than what they need, far more. So in the reality, it is apart from the case of corruption, which we live in on that side, it's really about planning. If you don't have a centralized planning for energy systems, you are not going to have decentralization. You're not going to have least cost in generation. You are not going to have clean fuels replacing fossil fuels. Planning is key. That's what we found it's lacking, and we do everything on that. I have to say, talking about gender, 78% of the project we do in energy for us have a gender component. But I would agree on one thing with you, extremely. I mean, the issue of clean cooking is a sore tooth. I don't think we have solved it at all. Even though the World Bank put $300 million in clean cooking every year, it's peanuts. And to be honest with you, it's all concentrated in Asia. I mean, Bangladesh or Cambodia or Nepal. Very little is in Africa. What are the problems? In my opinion, and I'm not an expert because I come from the banking side, one of the problems is education. So there is a kind of resistance to change, even though this makes sense. There is the fact that many times the utensils that are provided are not what the population wanted, i.e. they are pushed on them, but that's not what, there were not enough consultations. We had this problem, I have to say, in Africa, that the utensils were sent back because the taste of the food was so different that could not accommodate the normal family life. So I think there is a lot of education to be done, a lot of working together to find the right solutions. But I repeat, it is not something we are solving. So we are really working on it. We work with the Clean Cooking Alliance a lot. But I mean, no, we are not there, to be honest.
Okay, just go ahead.
Yeah, maybe I could just follow up on the clean cooking, because we also have an experience in building capacity in the clean cooking area, particularly in Tanzania, where we seem to find a way, sort of some of the barriers we have unlocked is related also to the value chain around the fuels. You cannot just address the issue by delivering alternative cooking devices or efficient cooking stove without looking at probably the whole value chain. And the second issue is, what do you do with the jobs that you replace for the people that deliver a traditional supply of charcoal or cut wood? So you have to address the entire value chain, and it seems to be we're making a traction there. I'm very happy with the early results of what we're doing there, because we're looking at not only the household and what you need to do with the household, but you have to look at the value chain of the clean cooking fuel itself, and the replacement, the jobs that you have to replace. Because if you have to if you replace these jobs of the traditional fuel suppliers, you don't do much development in the country. So this is one area just I wanted to touch, that there are possibilities to look creatively at this market, and we are experimenting there with some what I call value chain approaches. And again, from a banking perspective, the transaction cost might be still high, but as a development agenda, I think we're making a traction there. I want to go back again to some of the issues on how to address some of the de-risking. And I think one is, of course, the policy reform is important, but there is also what's called a pipeline of quality projects that is often you find in many of these countries. So you will still need some sort of a public facility instrument to do the initial pipeline development or project preparation kind of stage. And with little money, you can really make an amazing development. We're running one facility called the Private Finance Advisory PFAN. We have noticed for every $1 of donor money we invest in project preparation, we're able to raise $80 of private sector investment. So this is a good return on donor money in the sense that if you can, so there is still a role to de-risk at the level of the project by really developing what I call bankable, solid projects at the project developer level, and there's a need for this kind of facilities. Thanks.
Okay. Daniel would like to come in, and then I'll invite you, Esther.
Well, I think there were excellent questions that were raised. I can only echo on the clean cooking side that we have now a small team looking at clean cooking, but it's extremely difficult, in fact, to identify. Even some of the leading companies are still so small, with really lack of kind of credit history, that it's extremely difficult sort of to provide financing at scale in that space. The LPG sector, which might also be part of the solution, is slightly different, and that's, I think, something that we also need to look at. But I think we're clearly not there, and I think a lot more work needs to happen on that front. But I just wanted to come to what also Ben was mentioning on sort of the link between policy support and finance, and give one example, and also I think hope to respond to some extent to what David referred to. We have, for example, established a help desk for mini-grid developers. It's a green mini-grid help desk that is actually providing technical assistance of different kind of depth to developers on all kind of issues that arise, from demand side assessment to technical matters to helping them raise finance, etc. So I've been supporting quite a number of developers across Africa through the help desk. And the idea is that ultimately some of these companies that we support sort of on the technical assistance policy side, that they in turn can then be supported through some of the financing instruments that we or other partners are establishing, one of which is indeed the Facility for Energy Inclusion. And I'm pleased to note that the off-grid window of FAY is now operational. We had first close at $60 million in August this year, and all the conditions have just been met. So they are up and running, and certainly encourage those that have credible projects that sort of can contribute to the pipeline to get in touch with us as well as with the fund manager, so that we can in turn indeed deliver ultimately on the joint objectives. I think the last thing I just want to highlight is on result-based financing, and and also sort of how to look, for example, at the mini-grid sector in a more structured way. And I think we, as well as the World Bank and others, I think have, in the last year, in fact, started to work on programmatic approaches that kind of can be considered something equivalent to a scaling solar approach, if you want. For example, we just had an approval from the Green Climate Fund for a mini-grid program in DRC, where there have been 3 large mini-grid sites selected, with all the required kind of studies and work being prepared by the relevant government institutions, where there is a competitive tendering process being organized, and where we have now sort of the financing instrument, sort of a blended finance mix available, including resources from the Green Climate Fund blended with our own resources to support those that will be selected in that competitive process. And I think that's sort of one way to structure a program, and doing this more in a programmatic way. And I think there are other examples as well: Nigeria, Burkina Faso, just to mention 2 others. I think that's certainly something that we need to scale up and also apply in other countries.
Thank you, Esther. And we're dealing with all the questions, I think, in a very integral manner. So please feel free to respond also to the other questions, because we have just 5 minutes left. So, and I would like to give the floor to all those remaining in the panel.
Go ahead. Okay. The first question was revolving around subsidies needed, which should target female-headed households. I think that is food for thought, because in Kenya we have finances for women, for other projects, like we have what we call the Kenya Women Finance, where women can access loans and do their various projects. Then the second person asked about an issue on health impact from indoor air pollution. And I want to say, yes, this is a reality. In Kenya, Ministry of Energy, we did some study in 3 villages. And we found, yes, very many women and children under 5 years had actually lung problems related to indoor air pollution. And what we have been doing is to introduce clean energy solutions in those households to remove the pollutants from the households. And then there was another question on how to involve women entrepreneurs. I want to say that in Kenya, our Procurement Act of 2015 indicates that 30% of all contracts should be given to women, youth, and the disabled. So they are not given, but they should tender and competitively win, but not the men. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Frank, you would like to come in here?
Yes, thank you very much on these very interesting and pertinent questions. I think I would like to start with agreeing with our colleague from the World Bank in terms of how to engage the private sector. The policy environment is key. So having an improved policy environment requires political leadership, and this is the starting point, but we will not achieve the energy access objectives, neither the climate objectives, if we do not provide public resources in certain concessionality volumes to address the bottlenecks which otherwise would impede of expanding energy access. So that's why we invest annually more than 2.5 billion euros in this area. That's why institutions like the Green Climate Fund is investing also in this area. Just to give an example, in the last GCF board meeting in October, a proposal was approved from a Netherlands institution, FMO. The GCF provided 100 million US, and this is used to go from the project development phase to the investment phase, accompanying the private investor to then invest in renewable energy and provide access. As one example, through our bilateral aid program, we're working on addressing another bottleneck, which in many countries is hindering the engagement of the private sector, and that's the difficulty to have assurances that public buyers, public entities, will pay in time the energy they use. So to provide for the in-between time until they pay a liquidity support to the private investor, public resources are used. Just two examples of what I think the public sector can do, and we are doing to have a stronger engagement. But this is not a solution for situations where the policy environment is not suitable. So that's the key element. I think I want to not miss the opportunity to talk about the gender dimension, because it's an important feature. We are working throughout our bilateral program, throughout our engagement in multilateral financial mechanisms, particularly on climate, to, from the start off, have gender dimensions observed. Still, I agree with your assessment that we need to look again to have dedicated funding to address gender dimension, because through the mainstreaming approach, not necessarily all dimensions are addressed.
Perhaps just one or two ideas to pick up, because the data is extremely important. We have tools through the Energizing Finance, we have tools through the RISE. To bring in another concept, which was talked about in other sessions, it's about clarity and confidence. And so while the data will provide some needed clarity to prospective investors, on the private side I'm thinking in particular, where do they get that confidence? And in part it's a governance issue, in part it's a consistency issue, which is why I find the Kenya example so important for Africa. And I think we need to dig a little bit more deeply into that. What was it that enabled Kenya to stay on track from 2004 to 2018 and beyond? And what were the successions of, Esther just rattled them off very nicely, successions of regulations to be a little bit more efficient in terms of what are the policies that need to be more efficient? How do we do that in these other countries? That's my big concern. And so it's the clarity, but it's also the confidence that we need to figure out to make these finances flow, and obviously the services reach those people who still don't have any. Thanks.
Thank you so much, and thank you all for being here, for sharing your thoughts, for providing further information based on questions, very interesting questions from the discussants. We need to wrap up this session. It's 6 o'clock already. We've covered a wealth of topics, talking about policies, policy environments, political leadership, consistency, but also the need for public funding to create an enabling environment that will invite also private sector actors to play their role. We talked about financing for small, medium enterprises, the need to de-risk also to make these businesses really work, to develop also bankable initiatives. And I think, well, for me also the issue of focus, really focusing on those areas where financing is needed most, Sub-Saharan Africa, small, medium enterprises, and women very high on the agenda. Which means also we need to look beyond electricity and really look at clean cooking. And I think we all recognize that there is really a need for more funding in that space. So thank you very much for this very interesting session.